Chirag asked a question in relation to being eligible for the double grant of the permanent and the temporary partner visa when the visa is submitted or assessed, I should say. Now, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to draw this because I think it's a bit of it's not well understood in terms of how this works. When you're submitting for I'll just move my microphone over. When you're submitting for a 309 100, okay, so that's a combined application, or an 820 801, when you submit the paperwork, okay, you submit through the IMI portal, you submit your papers, all your evidence, okay, it's all uploaded to the department systems through the IMI portal. Eventually, this is assessed, okay, so let's say that takes 6 months to process it. You know what, let's be a little bit more conservative. Let's say 12 months to process your initial application, okay, which is a combined application for both these visa types. That's the temporary, that's the permanent, and that's the temporary, and that's the permanent. So what will happen is, in 12 months' time, your application is picked up by a case officer. Okay, someone in the department starts looking at your documentation, and they eventually go to assess your case. Now, what will happen is, let's say the default outcome will be the approval of the first stage of your combined application. Okay, so this is the better way to kind of look at this. By default, you're going to be granted the temporary visa first only. Okay, so that would be the 309 or the 820, depending if you've applied for on or offshore. And then 12 months later, so 24 months in total, 24 months from when you submitted the application. So you submitted here, it took 12 months to get to here, and then another 12 months passes, and you've reached 24 months from when you submitted the combined application. You're then eligible to be looked at again. Okay, this is the second point in time when they're going to look at your application. So think of it as, let's say, an eye. The government will look at your application at this point. This is one time they look at it, and the other time they look at it is in 24 months from when the application was submitted. Okay, I'm going to get back to the eye icon in a second. There's a reason I'm putting it as an eye. So they're going to look at your application about a month before. Okay, so about 23 months from lodgement. They get back in touch with you. They send you an email. And they say, hey, you're now eligible. You're being invited to submit updated documentation to prove that you're still together from the point from when this was granted. So show us evidence that covers this period here. Okay, so you don't need to give them everything you gave them back here. You just need to give them updated documents. So some new bank statements, a new lease, some new photos, anything you've done as a couple from the approval of your temporary partner visa to when they're now looking at your application again. Provide them recent documents, and then at some point after the 24-month mark, they will assess the permanent stage, and they will grant the 100 or the 801. Okay, that's the general common default outcome. However, there are some exceptions to this pathway, and it is when couples will be eligible for the double grant at this point in time, when they look at your relationship for the first time. And specifically, it's for couples that, when the visa is applied for, they have been together for 3 years, and I'm going to expand on that definition in a second, or 2 years if there's a child of the relationship when they look at it, as in there's a child at this point. So when we say 3 years, and that's the definition of long-term relationship, when we say 3 years, we mean 3 years as a de facto couple, or 3 years as a de facto plus married couple, or 3 years as a married couple. It's not 3 years together, because a year of that might have been dating. You may not have been in a de facto relationship yet. So it's quite a high threshold. 3 years de facto or married is quite a long time in comparison to, I suppose, to give you some context, a lot of couples that we work with or see or speak to, not many have been together for that long amount of time if they're applying for a partner visa. The majority are probably shorter than that. So statistically, I will tell you, at least for the cases that we see, the minority will qualify for the 3 years or even the 2 years if there's a child. The majority of applications will just be granted the temporary visa first. So Chirag was asking, can he provide a stat deck whilst he submitted his application, attach a stat deck, and ask the government to assess them against the double grant at this point in time, just because they're attaching a stat deck, requesting to be assessed or to be granted the double grant. It's not a discretionary something you can request. It's something you either qualify for or don't. And specifically, it's that you meet one of those two definitions. Attaching a stat deck is a useful tool to bring to the case officer's attention that you meet those requirements. So a stat deck would be, would say something along the lines of, we confirm that we have been in a de facto relationship since this point in time. That was at least 3 years prior to lodgement, so we kindly request that our application be considered against the double grant provisions, something along those lines. In reality, though, it doesn't matter what you say, because it's not about what you say, it's about what you prove. And what you're trying to prove is that you meet one of these two definitions. So that's the first thing I'll say. A stat deck doesn't accomplish anything if you don't meet the requirements. All a stat deck does is maybe helps the case officer understand the length of your relationship. But I would say what's better than a stat deck is your relationship timeline image. So if you're in this type of relationship and you think you meet those definitions, you just make sure that your timeline image, when you're putting forward your milestones, that you're very specific in saying that you were actually de facto back here. So visually represent that, make sure you've got that date specified. Say 1st of January 2018, that's when you're saying you became de facto, and give a case officer a visual representation of your timeline, which is something we recommend for any application, but particularly if you're trying to go for or trying to prove that you've been in a long-term relationship, that timeline image becomes even more important, because that's the best way to prove that you were de facto back then, is by showing it visually. So that's, I would place more emphasis on a timeline document than a stat deck. A stat deck doesn't really do anything.